2. 3 Late Fire Moon, September, 12:12 p.m.
Climb. I'm gonna go kill the guys upstairs. We don't have anything to tie them up with, and if they call for help, it'll be a pain. We could knock them out, but as long as there's a chance they'll wake up, it's gonna be dangerous to take control of this place, since we know so little about it. What's wrong?
Oh, it's nothing. Climb shook his head and cleared away his anxiety. His heart was pounding as if he had been sprinting at full speed, but he did his best to ignore it. Please excuse me. I'm all right now. I can go any time.
Are you sure? It seems like you got your game face on. You'd been acting a little weird since we got here, but now you look like a warrior. I understand you're nervous. There are powerful enemies here who you can't beat as you are now. But don't worry, I'm here and so is Sebas. You focus on surviving, for the one who keeps you going.
Brain gave Climb a hard pat on the shoulder and, blade already in hand, knocked 4 times on the door. Climb gripped his sword tightly. They heard someone clomping over and the sound of locks turning, 3 of them. The moment the door began to open, Climb acted according to their plan and yanked it as hard as he could. Brain rushed the man faster than he could raise a puzzled shout. Climb heard the sound of flesh being severed and the thudding of something crumpling to the ground. He jumped in a moment later. Ahead of him, Brain was cutting down their second opponent. There was one other man in the room, with a short sword and leather armor. Climb closed the distance between them in one swoop.
What's with you little shit?
The man panicked and tried to stab Climb with his short sword, but Climb parried it easily. Then he brought his sword down from overhead in one swift motion. The man tried to knock it with his short blade, but it was certainly not going to take the weight of Climb's entire body in that heavy blow. Climb's sword knocked away his opponent's weapon, sliced into his shoulder, and came out near the base of his neck. As the fallen man groaned in pain, a profusion of blood spread across the floor, so much that one might wonder where it had all come from. The body jerked and twitched before lying still in death. Judging it to be a fatal blow, Climb kept his momentum and forged ahead into the room while still on guard. There were no enemies lurking to bring their swords down on him. He heard Brian racing up the stairs to the second floor behind him. All that was in the room was commonplace furniture. After confirming that, Climb ran into the next room. 1 minute later, having inspected their respective floors and determined there were no other enemies, Climb and Brian met up at the entrance. I took a look around the first floor, but I didn't get a sense anyone was there.
The same for the second floor. There weren't even any beds, so no one spends the night there. There must be a secret passageway to the place where people sleep.
Did you find it? I doubt it would be on the second floor, but...
Nah, I didn't see anything that looked like a trapdoor. But if what you said is right, then it's down here.
Climb and Brian exchanged glances, and then examined the room. Climb didn't have any thief skills, so he couldn't discover any hidden door by glancing around. If he'd had a fine powder, like flour, and some time to thoroughly search, he could have found the door by sprinkling it around and blowing. The powder would have collected in the door's crack and made it easier to find. But he didn't have any powder, and he didn't have any time to scatter it. So he took some magic items from his pochette. They were small handbells he'd received from Gagaran of Blue Roses.
It's dangerous to go adventuring without a thief, but sometimes you just have to. At times like those, having these will make a big difference,
she'd said to him. He considered the pictures drawn on the outer surfaces of the 3 bells and chose the one he needed. It was called the Bell of Secret Door Detection. As Brain watched him with intense interest, he rang it once. A clear tone, audible to only the owner of the item, echoed through the room. Responding to the bell, one corner of the floor began to glow a pale blue. It blinked as if to say, "Here's the trapdoor."
Wow, that's a handy item. Everything I have is for making me stronger to use in combat.
Isn't that normal for a warrior, though?
A warrior.
Climb moved away from Brian and his wry grin, remembering the location of the reaction, and took a spin around the rest of the room. The effect of the item's magic lasted only a set amount of time. He needed to investigate as thoroughly as possible before it wore off. He circled the area, but there was nothing besides the first spot. All they had to do now was open the trapdoor and sneak inside, but Climb squinted at it. Then he sighed and took his bells back out. This time he chose one with a different picture on it and rang it like the other one. The tone was similar to the first's, but different, the bell of trap removal. He was being very careful. Climb didn't have the ability to detect and disable traps, nor did he have any means to escape one if he were to get caught. If they'd had a caster with them, they could treat him as if he got hit with paralysis or poison, but he and Brian were only 2 warriors. Climb once heard that there was a martial art that granted temporary immunity to poison, but he didn't know it, and he didn't have an antidote. He had to consider himself out of commission if he got a bad status. A case like that called for using a magic item without hesitation, even if it could only be used a limited number of times per day. There came a heavy clunk from behind the trap door. Climb stuck his sword in the door's gap and pried it open. One big corner of the wooden floor came up and clapped down onto the other side. There was a crossbow attached to the underside of the door. The tip of its quarrel shone in the light, reflecting in a strange way different from the way plain metal would. Climb changed positions and stared at the crossbow. A highly viscous liquid was slathered on the tip of the bolt. It was almost certainly poisoned. If they had carelessly opened the door, they'd have been shot with poison. Exhaling with a bit of relief, Climb tried to see if he could also take the crossbow off the door. Unfortunately, it was attached pretty well, and he would have needed tools to remove it. Giving up on that, he peered past the door. A fairly steep staircase led down, but he couldn't see where due to the angle. The stairs and their surroundings were solidly built out of stone.
So what are you going to do? Wait here?
I'm not very good at indoor combat. If possible, I'd like to go down and take up a position in a more spacious area where it would be easier to fight, if there is one.
In a one-on-one fight, it's to your advantage to wait at the top of the stairs, but if you end up fighting here, I might not be able to hear the commotion from farther down, and if reinforcements show up... Yeah, maybe we should skip that idea. Want to go together, then?
Yes, please.
I'll go in front. Follow me, but keep a little distance.
Understood. And about that item I used to remove the trap, I can use it up to 3 times per day, but not in a row. I have to leave 30 minutes before I can use it again, so we can't rely on it.
Gotcha. We'll be as careful as possible. If you notice anything, let me know.
With that, Brian stepped down into the staircase. Climb followed behind him. Brian descended step by step, tapping each one with his katana first, just in case. At the bottom of the stairs, the floor was well laid with cobbles, and the walls were also fortified with stone. Several feet ahead they could see a wooden door with iron reinforcements. Brian didn't really think there would be more than the crossbow booby-trapping this emergency escape route, but he'd heard too many stories about heavily armored warriors being rendered helpless by a single pitfall. He definitely had to avoid that. It was only a short distance, but Brian took his time, stepping cautiously, to reach the door. Climb stood by at the bottom of the stairs so he wouldn't get caught up in an accident if there was one. First, Brian poked at the door with his sword. After a few times, he seemed to make up his mind, grabbed the doorknob, and turned it. Then he stopped moving. Climb was worried something had happened when Brian turned around and said pathetically, "It's locked." Of course it was. It made sense for the door to be locked.
Do you have any way to open it? If not, we can break it down, but...
I do, actually. One moment.
Climb rang the third handbell at the door. They heard the faint noise of the latch opening by the power of the bell of unlocking. Brian turned the knob and opened the door slightly to peek inside.
There's no one here. I'll go in first.
Climb entered after Brian. It was a large room. Around the edges of the walls were cages and wooden boxes big enough to fit a person inside. Was it a storage room? It seemed a little too big for what was in there. Across the room was a door without a lock. Climb strained his ears and heard some noises like a faraway commotion. Brian turned and asked Climb,
"How about here? It fits the bill for space, but you might end up having to fight multiple enemies at once."
If a group shows up, I'll open the entrance door and fight near the stairs.
Okay, I'm going to take a quick look and be right back. Don't die, Climb.
I won't. You be careful, too.
Do you mind if I borrow these items?
Of course not. I'm sorry I didn't offer.
Climb handed all 3 bells over to Bryan, and Bryan tucked them into a pouch on his belt. Then, with a proper warrior-like bravery on his face, Bryan said,
Okay, I'm going in,
and advanced deeper into the brothel. Climb, on his own now, looked around the room. First, he checked to make sure there was no one hiding in the shadows of the wooden boxes and no secret passageways. It was only a warrior search in the end, but it didn't seem like there were any hidden doors. Next, he examined the countless containers. If possible, he wanted to acquire some information about other 8 Fingers facilities besides this one. If there were smuggled or otherwise illegal goods here, that would be great. Of course, a general search would be done after they'd occupied the building, but he figured he should investigate as well as he could on his own first. There were large boxes and small ones, but he decided to approach the largest. It was probably almost 7 feet to a side. He inspected it to make sure it wasn't booby-trapped. Of course, like before, Climb had no searching abilities, so he couldn't even begin to pretend to be a thief. He put his ear to the box and listened. He didn't think anything was shut inside it, but there was no telling what could happen in an underworld place like this. It was possible they were smuggling some sort of animal. Unsurprisingly, he didn't hear anything. Next, he moved to take off the lid. It didn't open. It wouldn't budge. He scanned for something like a crowbar or a poker, but from his cursory investigation it didn't seem like there were any tools like that in the room. Oh well. He tried the next box, which was about 3 feet to his side. This one opened with no trouble. There were all sorts of clothes inside, from simple sack dresses to garments fit for daughters of nobles. What's all this? Is there something hidden under all these clothes? Doesn't look like it. Is it spare clothing? This is like a laborer's outfit. And here's a maid uniform. What the heck is this? Climb racked his brain, unable to figure out what all the clothes could be for. He picked up a piece, and it seemed utterly normal. If crime was involved in some way, the only thing he could think of was that they might be stolen, but that wasn't evidence that could help them take out the brothel. Deciding to leave alone things he didn't understand, he moved on to the next box, which was as big as the first. Then a loud bang suddenly echoed throughout the room. There was no way. He'd searched every corner and made sure there was no one. Then he came upon a realization. What if someone using invisibility was here from the very start? Climb shivered at the thought, and whirled to face the direction of the noise had come from. The unopened 7-foot box. One side was flush against the wall. The side opposite had come off. The exposed contents were not cargo, but 2 men. In the back was a tunnel. What should have been a wall was actually a hole. The wooden box, of course, connected to a secret passageway. Climb blinked furiously in genuine surprise as the 2 men came out. An unpleasant sweat ran down his back. One of the men fit Sebas's description perfectly. His name was Succulent. He was their biggest obstacle in this infiltration mission, as well as their prime candidate for capture. One of the 6 arms, who were equivalent to adamantite-rank adventurers. Grasping a drawn blade, the enemy Climb had no chance of defeating narrowed his eyes and said,
We knew from alarm there was an invader, so we came through the secret passageway specifically not to bump into him. I guess we should have made some other way out.
Well, there's nothing we can do about it now, the man behind him answered in a high-pitched voice. I've seen this kid somewhere before.
Considering our circumstances, I'm going to be very angry if you tell me you slept with him.
Oh, come on, Succulent. Don't be like that. It couldn't be. But I do believe he's the little pet of the female who pisses me off more than any other in the world.
Oh, so he serves the princess?
Succulent flicked his eyes over Climb from top to bottom as if he were lapping him up. The eyes of the man behind him were filled with unsettling lust, but Succulent was estimating Climb's strength as a warrior, perhaps, like a snake, trying to judge whether this prey would fit in his mouth. The man in the back licked his lips and said to Succulent,
I want to take him with us. What do you think?
A chill went up Climb's spine, and he felt a twinge in his anus. Ugh, this guy's...
It'll cost extra.
Disregarding Climb's mental screams, Succulent turned to face him. There had never been any openings, but now Climb was beset by the feeling he was facing a solid fortress. Succulent took a purposeful stride forward. Climb took a step back from the encroaching pressure. Perhaps this was obvious, but a fight between two clearly different powers never lasted very long. Still, Climb would have to make it happen.
If I maintain a defensive posture and focus all my efforts on blocking, I might be able to buy time till one of the others gets here.
But there was something he had to do first. He took a deep breath.
Help!
He screamed at the top of his lungs, using up every last bit of air inside them. Winning the battle on his own was not victory. Victory meant capturing both of these men. Or, to put it another way, losing either of these powerful men and their presumably ample intelligence unfortunately meant a loss. So what reason could there be for hesitating to call for help? Succulent's face grew stern. The scream gave his opponents an urgent need to finish their battle in a short amount of time. It was extremely likely that they'd pull out the big guns. Climb continued observing their every movement.
Crocodile, it seems it will be a bit troublesome to bring him with us. We need to settle this before he gets back up.
Huh? You're one of the 6 arms, aren't you? You can't even knock out one little brat. The title of illusion maniac weeps.
Well, if you're going to put it that way, I'll do what I can. But please remember that as long as you escape, we win.
Climb continued to stare down Succulent, trying to figure out why he was called Illusion Maniac. He wouldn't have a nickname that had nothing to do with his abilities, so if Climb could figure out the reason for the nickname, he might get a clue about the kind of abilities he could use. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could learn from his appearance or equipment. He knew he was at a disadvantage, but he roared to encourage himself.
I'm protecting this door with my life! As long as I'm still standing, neither of you will leave this room!
We'll know if that's true or not soon enough, when you're shamefully flat on the floor. Succulent slowly brought his sword up.
Huh?
Climb did a double take, because the sword flickered. It wasn't some kind of trick. The strange phenomenon ended right away, but he definitely hadn't been seeing things.
It must be some kind of martial art.
Perhaps it had something to do with being an illusion maniac. In that case, he was probably already using some kind of power. Climb wasn't off his guard, but he did need to bring it up a notch. Succulent charged, brandishing his sword overhead. His technique didn't seem worthy of an adamantite-rank adventurer. It was a little sloppier than Climb's. Climb held his sword up to block, in line with the trajectory of the incoming blade, but a creeping sensation made him jump to the side. Suddenly a sharp pain ran across his flank, and he was knocked back.
Ah!
He staggered into the wall behind him. He didn't have time to figure out what had happened. Succulent was already right up in front of him. He was raising his sword again, like last time. Climb held his blade up to protect his head, and did a diving roll to the left. A sharp pain ran across his upper right arm. Coming out of his nimble roll, he swung his sword behind him without bothering to look. He sliced air. Realizing there wouldn't be a follow-up attack, he held his right arm and turned around. Succulent was running for the door that led to the stairs while keeping one eye on him. Climb ignored the man's attempt to open the door and instead focused on Crocodile. He had a hunch that this would be enough to stop Succulent, who was responsible for Crocodile's security, and he was right. Succulent's hands stopped. He took up a position between Crocodile and Climb and clicked his tongue in frustration. Then he looked at the exit, Climb, and Crocodile in turn, and grimaced.
We're trapped. You'll have to excuse me. I'm killing this boy here.
You can't be serious. He'll be a great asset against that little bitch if we keep him alive.
He tricked me, taking up a position to protect the door, saying he'd protect it with his life. That was all part of his plan. This little brat, he's messing with my head.
Yes, he bought it. So I guess now they don't know what's going on outside this room. Now they can't run.
With only one escort, it was a bad plan to run while Climb was still alive and able to fight, and if Climb had friends upstairs, they'd be caught in between. For the same reason, Succulent couldn't let Crocodile run on his own before finishing the boy off. When Climb had immediately abandoned the door he would supposedly protect with his life and made a move toward Crocodile, Succulent fell for the bluff. Now he was probably convinced someone was waiting on the other side to catch them in a pincer attack and capture Crocodile. He had to have judged that the only way to escape safely was to take out Climb now. Of course, that was assuming he wasn't aware of conditions outside the room. If he knew the truth, he would open the door and run away. Climb, having won his bet, raised his sword against Succulent's growing desire to kill. Ugh! He had to bear the pain in his side and right upper arm. He might have had a few broken bones, but he was lucky he could still move. If that pervert weren't lusting after him, he probably would have been killed. Wearing a male shirt wasn't enough to completely block a slice.
But what is that attack anyway? Is he swinging again really fast? I don't think that's it. But then what could it be?
Gazef's face flickered across the back of Climb's mind. Gazef Stronov's original martial art, six-fold slash of light, was 6 attacks at once. So was this some sort of lesser version of that, like a two-fold slash of light? But in that case, Succulent's art was a weird one, where the first attack was at normal speed and the second was super fast.
It doesn't match up. If I can figure out what kind of attack it is, I should be able to do something about it. All I know is that a defensive battle is not going to go very well for me. I guess I should attack.
Climb swallowed hard and broke into a run. His gaze moved from Succulent to Crocodile. Succulent's face warped like he'd bitten down on something bitter.
When you're acting as security, you hate it when the one under your protection gets targeted, even if it's merely as a threat. I'm the same way, so I know how it goes.
Executing a tactic he'd hate to have to deal with himself, he closed in.
A maniac of illusions. Well, I can imagine. Well, maybe his name is misleading, but it's worth testing.
Once in range, he brought down his sword, but Succulent unsurprisingly deflected it easily. Climb braced through the shock and struck again. He wasn't swinging from overhead, so there wasn't a ton of power behind it, but it was still enough. Succulent's blade deflected his again, and Climb took some distance with a satisfied nod.
It's an illusion, not a martial art!
He'd felt something was off the moment his sword was deflected. It felt like the block occurred a little bit in front of the blade he could see.
Your whole right arm is an illusion. The real arm and sword are invisible.
In other words, the sword he'd blocked had been an illusion, and the real one had cut into his flesh. Any hint of emotion disappeared from Succulent's face, and he began to speak in a flat voice. That's right. It's nothing more than a combination of a spell that can make parts of things invisible, and a spell that causes hallucinations. I'm an illusionist and a fencer. It's a lame trick once you know the secret, right? You can laugh. There was no way he could laugh. Sure, putting it into words made it sound so simple he wondered why he hadn't thought of it. But there was something scarier than an invisible sword in combat where one hit could mean death, and being able to only half see through it was as confusing as it sounded. Since I diversified my abilities, I might be less of a warrior than you, but... Succulent flourished his sword. But was that even really his arm? It was entirely possible that this was an illusion, and his real arm had a dagger out and was waiting for the right time to throw. The dread of illusion set in, and Climb broke into a cold sweat. Illusionists can only use spells that belong to the illusion tree of arcane magic. In the upper tiers, some illusion attacks fool the brain to death, but I haven't gotten there yet.
That seems fishy. What proof do I have that it's true?
Right. Succulent laughed. Well, you don't need to believe me. Anyhow, what was I trying to say? Oh yeah. Because of that, I can't cast strengthening spells on myself, and I can't cast weakening spells on you. But can you tell the difference between illusion and reality? As he finished speaking, Succulent split into multiple succulents. Multiple vision! One would think that the real one was in the center, but there was no guarantee of that.
Why did I give time to a caster?
It was Climb's goal to buy time, but giving a caster leeway to cast support spells was too dangerous. Climb screamed a battle cry, used an art to boost his abilities and perception, and closed the gap between him and Succulent all at once. Scintillating Scotoma!
Ugh!
Charging forward, he swung his sword to mow down all the succulents at once, but only one of them was in range. To get them all, he'd have to be fighting at extremely close quarters. Climb wouldn't be able to get enough momentum behind the blade at that distance. The unlucky succulent fell to the side in halves, but no blood spurted out, and the sword moved smoothly through him.
Better luck next time.
A chill slithered up from Climb's bowels. He was suddenly hot near his throat. He brought up his left hand to protect the hot area. A sharp pain coursed through his hand, and he felt the awful sensation of fresh blood soaking his clothes. If he hadn't sensed the killing urge, if he had hesitated to sacrifice his hand, his throat would have been slashed. Relieved to be alive, he gritted his teeth against the pain and swept his blade sideways. Again, it met no resistance and slashed only air. It can't go on like this. Realizing that, Climb switched arts and used evasion as he backed away. His field of vision contained the two remaining succulents raising their swords at the same time. Knowing that both blades were illusions, he focused his attention on his ears. The mail shirt he was wearing and the beating of his heart made a racket. Right now the only things he wanted to hear were the sounds of the man in front of him. No. There! It was definitely not the sound of a sword being brought down. The faint sound of something slicing through the air was approaching his face from an empty space in front of him. He rushed to turn his head, and along with the searing sensation that streaked across his cheek, he felt his flesh being painfully torn off. A hot liquid flowed down his cheek and ran down his neck.
There's a 50% chance!
Spitting the blood that had welled up in his mouth, Climb bet all he had on a single attack. Because he'd used it as a shield earlier, his left arm was pure agony from the wrist down. It was possible the nerves had been severed, so he couldn't even be sure his fingers would work right. Still, if he could line them up, he could grip the hilt of his sword. An explosion of pain coursed through him, and he grit his teeth, but his left hand moved and gripped the hilt. The limb probably felt swollen only because of the excruciating injury. He grasped his sword tightly with both hands, mustering all the strength he could find, and brought the blade down from overhead. Blood spurted. He felt the blade cut into something hard, and the sticky red sprayed up like a fountain. It seemed he'd nailed the real one this time. Apparently he'd hit a vital point, and Succulent thudded to the floor. Climb couldn't believe he'd won against someone said to be adamantite equivalent, but it was definitely true that the man was lying on the floor. He suppressed the joy welling up inside him, and returned Kokodal's stare. It didn't seem like he had the will to run away. Perhaps because Climb had relaxed a bit, the pain in his cheek and left hand was enough to make him feel sick. I can't quite call this a victory. Taking Succulent prisoner would have been best, but it had been impossible for him. Still, if he could capture a man escaping with the protection and assistance of the 6 arms, they should be able to get plenty of intelligence. As he stepped forward to capture him, Climb felt something was off in the man's expression. He seemed too composed. Why? At that moment, a searing sensation ripped through his abdomen. The tension drained from his body all at once, leaving him limp as a puppet. His vision went black for a moment, and when he came to, he was on the floor. He couldn't understand what had happened. A pain filled his abdomen, like a burning iron rod had been shoved into his stomach, and he exhaled roughly. All he could see was the floor, but then a pair of legs entered his field of vision.
Unfortunately for you, I can't let you win.
Climb struggled to look up, and what he saw was a nearly unscathed Succulent.
Fox sleep. An illusion after you get injured. That hurt. You probably thought you'd finished me off, right?
His finger traced a straight line across his chest. It was the path Climb's sword had followed. Climb's breath was coming short and rough. He could feel the blood flowing from his abdomen, soaking into his mail shirt and clothes. I'm going to die. Pain was tearing at his consciousness, and he frantically held on before he lost it. If I black out, I'll die for sure. But even as he stayed conscious, it was only a matter of time, and the probability Succulent would finish him off was extremely high. He'd done battle with a man on par with an adamantite rank adventurer. He'd probably even put up a good fight. There was nothing left to do now but give up. It meant the gap in their strength wasn't indisputable. But he couldn't give up. There was no way he could give up. Climb clenched his teeth so hard it seemed like they would break. He couldn't stand to allow someone to die, or to die himself, without Renaer's permission. Groaning and grinding his teeth, he steeled himself, although he'd already lost to the intense pain. I can't die yet! There's no way I can die yet! He desperately remembered Renaer. He wanted to go home to her today, like always.
We don't have time for this, so I'm going to go ahead and finish you off. Later.
Succulent turned his sword on the groaning boy. His prey was fatally wounded, and death was only a matter of time, but Succulent had the feeling it would be better to finish him off here, once and for all.
Hey, why don't we take him with us?
Please, Crocodile, no. There's a good chance this brat has friends on the other side of that door, and even if we take him with us, he'll die before we get to a safe place. Please give it up.
Then let's at least bring his head. We can arrange it with some flowers and send it to that female brat.
Okay. I guess that's fine. Whoa!
Succulent leaped aside. The boy had flashed his sword. For a boy on the edge of death, it was a sharp, steady swing. Succulent had been gazing at his pitiful prey and its frantic resistance with contempt, but now his eyes widened. The boy leaned on his sword and stood up. That should have been impossible. Succulent had killed more people than he could count on his fingers, and in his estimation, that blow should have been fatal. The boy should not have been able to stand. But the scene before his eyes betrayed the knowledge born of his experience. Oh, so easily.
How can you stand?
He felt sick to his stomach. The boy was practically an undead. Before his pale face and the long string of drool hanging down from it, Succulent could only think he had ceased to be human.
I can't die yet. I need to turn access there.
Faced with those strangely twinkling eyes, Succulent caught his breath for a moment. He was afraid. He was frightened of this boy who had done the impossible. The boy staggered, and Succulent returned to himself. What washed over him at this moment was shame. He couldn't believe he, one of the 6 arms, had been afraid of a lesser opponent.
You half-dead trash! Die already!
Succulent charged. He was sure the boy would die if he stabbed him, but he was taking him too lightly. Certainly the total gap between them was overwhelmingly obvious. However, Succulent was an illusionist and a fencer, while Climb was a warrior. In terms of pure combat ability, Climb was no weaker than Succulent. More than a match for him, in fact. It was only because of magic that Climb was at a disadvantage. Without magic protection, Succulent was the weaker of the two. His blade descended with a roar, followed by a shrill clang. The reason it had been possible to block the boy's overhead swing was because his movements on the brink of death were sluggish. A cold sweat ran down Succulent's face. His opponent was nearly dead. That thought had distracted him, clouded his vision, but now his eyes popped open. As a fencer, he'd trained to evade his opponent's attacks. The reason he blocked the boy's strike with his sword was because it was that extraordinary.
That was not the attack of a person on the verge of death.
Those words flitted across Succulent's mind in his panic.
His sword is actually moving faster than when he wasn't hurt. What the heck? What's with this kid?
He was standing in another realm of combat. It wasn't impossible, but Succulent had never seen someone like that in real life. It felt more like something had come undone.
What's going on? Are you using a magic item? A martial art?
His voice was distraught. He was concerned, unsure who was superior anymore. What had happened to Climb? It's simple. Thanks to Sebas's training, his sense of self-preservation was confused. His determination to live overlapped with the death he'd seen before in Sebas's training, and his brain's limiter had come off in the same way as then to unleash hysterical strength. The training had consisted of being shown only one move, but without it he would have died here and now, helpless. A hard blow sent Succulent flying. The shock of slamming into the floor traveled through his back and rocked his stomach. His orichalcum mail shirt absorbed some of the impact, but even so, the wind was knocked from his lungs, and he couldn't breathe for a moment.
What happened?
As the one who'd received the blow, Succulent couldn't understand. But to Crocodile, who was standing to the side, it was obvious. He'd been kicked. The moment his overhead swing had been blocked, the boy had unleashed a kick at Succulent. Still not sure what had happened, Succulent hurried to his feet. For fencers who pride themselves on their agility, lying on the ground was the same as being in the jaws of death.
Shit! This kid uses his feet. That's not very soldierly. If you would fight by the rules...
Succulent whined with a click of his tongue as he rolled and rushed to steady himself. This wasn't the fighting cultivated by soldier training. That dirty style made this feel like a battle with an adventurer, so he couldn't underestimate him. Succulent began to feel anxious. He thought at first that it'd be an easy win, that he'd be able to kill this little brat no problem. But now he felt that confidence ebbing. Now on his feet he saw the dangerous-seeming boy slowly crumple to the ground and held his breath. From the boy's complexion, it looked like the previous exchange had expanded the rest of his life. No, that was exactly what had happened. He had exhibited the power of a candle, flaring that moment before it goes out. But now so much as a light push would probably kill him. Succulent felt slightly relieved, but confusion and rage soon overtook him at the fact that he, one of the 6 arms, the strongest members of the 8 fingers, could feel this cornered by a single soldier. At the fact that he'd worried at all. But now the fight was decided. All that was left was to kill him and escape. But...
I'll have you stop right there!
It seemed like he'd made it just in time. Climb lay on the floor, his face clammy with sweat and paler than white. Nevertheless, he was still alive. But the wound in his abdomen was fatal, so he'd die if there was any delay in getting him treatment. With no sense of relief, Brian charged into the room. There were 2 men there. One seemed entirely incapable of fighting.
Don't worry about that shady guy. Just kill the kid.
He'll charge me and kill me instantly if I do that. He isn't like that brat. I can't win against him unless I focus and fight with all my might. If I let my guard down for an instant or get even distracted, he'll be over.
Brian understood that the one who'd replied was Succulent. He did fit the description he'd heard. The warrior could have deduced the man's identity from his double and blood-spattered sword alone, but now he knew for sure. Brian walked briskly forward without a word, drawing his katana and striking in one fluid motion, but Succulent had already jumped away. The sword sliced through nothing but air. Brian had swung it only to get him away from Climb anyway. He stepped over the fallen boy and took up a position, protecting him.
Climb, are you okay? Do you have any healing items?
He asked quickly, with no time to lose. If he didn't have something, they'd need to come up with another plan as soon as possible.
He panted.
Yes.
Brian glanced down and saw Climb's hand had let go of his sword and was moving.
Okay,
he answered, feeling deeply relieved. Then he turned a severe stare on Succulent.
Starting now, I'm your opponent. I'll be taking revenge for him. Given the katana, I guess I shouldn't be surprised you'd be so confident. Those rarely find their way this far north. I've never even heard of one in the kingdom. Can I ask your name?
Brian didn't feel like answering. He and Climb had had the same objective. They were comrades. With Climb half dead, how could he answer a question like that as if nothing had happened? Brian suddenly wondered to himself, was I always like this? Hadn't he abandoned everything besides growing stronger with a sword? He cocked his head slightly and laughed to himself. Oh, I see. His heart, his dreams, his goals, his livelihood, his very way of life, it had all been broken by the monster Shaltir Bloodfallen. The boy called Climb must have wedged himself into those cracks the moment he'd earned Brian's admiration for being able to withstand the mysterious Sebas's brutal intent to kill when Brian himself couldn't, despite being weaker. He'd seen the brilliance of this young soldier who had something he did not. He stood in front of Climb and exchanged glares with Succulent. Can I get Climb to see the same thing in me as I saw in him that time? His old self would have burst out laughing, saying, "You've gone soft." He used to think that bearing the burden of another made a warrior weak. He thought warriors needed to be sharp. But now he understood. This is another way to live. I get it, Kazef. But I never made it to where you are. Did you not hear me? How about I ask you again? What's your name? Sorry. I don't think it'll matter if I tell you, but sure, I'll answer. I'm Brian Unglaus. Succulent's eyes opened wide.
What? The Brian Unglaus?
No way! That's him? He's not impersonating him?
No, Crocodile, there's no doubt about it. A valuable weapon shows a warrior's rank. If he's really who he says he is, a katana makes sense.
Brian grinned bitterly. The fact that most people I've met today knew who I am might have made my old self happy, but right now I can't say I really care. Succulent's smile of goodwill confused him, but his questions were cleared up immediately.
Hey, Unglaus, why don't we quit fighting? A man of your caliber should be one of us. How about it? Want to join? I'm sure you'd be able to be one of the 6 arms. I can tell you're strong by looking at you. You're the same as us. You want power, don't you? I can see it in your eyes.
Well, you're not wrong.
In that case, the 8 Fingers isn't a bad gig. For people with strength, it's the best place to be. You can even get your hands on powerful magic items. Check out my orichalcum mail shirt, my mithril sword, my rings, my clothes, my boots. They're all magic. So, Brian Unglaus, join us. Be one of the 6 arms with me.
Is that all? Sounds lame. Succulent's face froze at Brian's unbelievably cold, insulting answer.
What?
You didn't hear me? I said that a bunch of guys with nothing but strength doesn't sound like much of a great group.
You bastard. If that's what you think, then you might not be so tough either.
You're right. I don't think I am strong. Not someone like me who's seen a real monster. Brian took pity on the frog sitting comfortably in his well, thinking he was powerful, and gave him a genuine compassionate warning.
And that goes for you, too. We may be about equal, which is why I'll warn you. We're not that great at all.
Brian turned to check over his shoulder on Climb, who had just finished drinking a potion.
And I've learned something. Strength for someone else's sake surpasses the strength of one alone.
Brian smiled. It was a friendly, pleasant smile.
Maybe it's only sunk in a little, but I know. I have no idea what you're talking about. It's too bad, Unglaus. I can't believe I have to kill the genius swordsman who once gave Stronov a run for his money.
I wonder if you can really kill me, swinging your sword only for yourself.
Yeah, I can. I can kill you without breaking a sweat. I'm gonna kill you, and then I'm gonna kill that brat lying on the floor. I'm not playing anymore, and I'm not holding back. I'm going all out.
Without taking his eyes off Succulent, who began casting a spell, he cautioned Climb when he sensed movement behind him.
Don't move, Climb. You're not fully healed, are you?
The movement stopped. Brian smiled, and, with the same surprise he'd felt himself earlier, said,
Leave the rest to me.
Thanks.
Brian smiled instead of responding and sheathed his sword. As he lowered his hips, he flipped his sword and sheath upside down.
Please be careful. Succulent uses illusions. Not everything you see will be real.
That does make him a tricky opponent, but that's fine.
Brian silently, motionlessly watched Succulent. At some point, 5 images of him appeared. Not only that, they appeared to contain magic sparks, shrouded in something like mantles of shadow. He had no idea what kind of spells those were.
Thanks for the prep time. Give a caster a little time, and he can become even stronger than a warrior. Your defeat is certain, Unglaus.
Yeah, don't mention it. Now that I talked with my friend here, I know for sure that I'm not going to lose.
Shut your mouth. You didn't move because you're protecting the brat? How nice of you.
He heard Climb shift on the floor. The boy must have felt bad for giving the enemy time to cast, and that was why Brian announced, loud enough for Climb to hear,
1 hit. What? I said I'm finishing this in 1 hit, Succulent. Just try it.
Succulent charged at Brian with his after-images trailing behind him. He came into range, and Brian turned around, calmly showing Succulent his defenseless back. Then, at a godly speed, he attacked over Climb, drawing his sword with a flash into space, where there was no one. There was a crash, and the walls shook. Climb from the floor, and Crocodile turned toward the source of the noise. It was Succulent.
His body was on the ground, not so much as twitching. His sword lay nearby. Brian's single blow had knocked Succulent back, slamming him into the wall with unbelievable momentum. If he hadn't struck him with the back of the blade, he surely would have been cut in half, even with his orichalcum mail, or so one might think after witnessing such a blow. It doesn't matter if an opponent is invisible. My martial art domain can still detect him. Using auditory illusions to draw my attention forward while attacking from the rear. That's a great plan, but it wasn't going to work on me. And it was stupid of him to go for you, too. He was probably going to kill you and then say, "See, you couldn't protect him." But he diverted too much attention from me to target you. Did he forget who he was fighting? Brian smiled at Climb. "See? One hit. Magnificent." Another voice's magnificent overlapped with Climb's. The two of them were taken by surprise. It was Sebas's voice, but that wasn't what shocked them. They were startled at the direction it had come from for a reason. They both looked to where Kokodal had been standing and found Sebas with Kokodal crumpled up on the ground. "When did you get here?" Brian asked. Sebas answered calmly. "Just now. It seems like you didn't notice because you were both so focused on Succulent." "Oh, I see," Brian answered, but he didn't really think it could be possible. "I was using domain. It covers a small area, but if he ran in a straight line from the front of me, he should have been in it. But I didn't detect him. The only one I've ever seen who could move like that was Shaltir Bloodfallen. I thought so when I felt that killing intent before. But is he of that monster's level? Who is this guy?" "I went ahead and saved all the prisoners. Also, apologies to Climb, but several people put up quite a bit of resistance, so I was forced to kill them. Please forgive me. But I guess I should heal him before I say all that." Sebas went over and put his hand to Climb's abdomen. It was only for a moment. He'd barely touched him when he was already pulling away. But the effects were drastic. Even with the potion, Climb's face had been pale, but color returned immediately. "You healed me? So you're a priest?" "No, I didn't heal you with the power of the gods. I poured chi into you." "A monk! I see, that makes sense." Now Brian understood why Sebas didn't have any armor or weapons, and he gave him an affirming smile. "What are you two planning on doing now?" "I've come this far. I'll stay with you till this is finished." "Well, first I'm going to run to a guardhouse, explain what's happened here, and see if we can get some soldiers to help us. I'd like you to hold down the fort here while I do that, but it's possible that reinforcements from the Eight Fingers will come." "That sounds fine to me. But could you leave me out of your explanation? I originally came to this country for business, so I'd rather not poke my head in any further into its underworld." "It's fine to mention me if you want. You can tell them Stronov will vouch for me." "Ah, understood."